Welcome to the Living After Faith podcast, a podcast designed to help you as you leave religion and move forward with your life. We are the official podcast of RecoveringReligionists.com, a recovery group founded by Dr. Darrell Ray, the author of The God Virus. We welcome your feedback. You can contact us by going to livingafterfaith.com and facebook.com/livingafterfaith and follow us on Twitter at LAFwithme. And now, here's today's program on Living After Faith with Rich and Deanna Joy Lyons.
I'm Deanna Joy Lyons.
And I'm Rich Lyons.
Come laugh with me.
We've had a lot of emails about the subject we're going to talk about today. A lot of people have asked us about how do atheists deal with death. And death, if you're, especially our audience, you're coming out of Christianity or some other faith, and all of those faiths do a very good job of answering the death question. They simply say, no biggie, you're going to live forever, you're in a better place. But once you reject that religion, at some point you're going to have to deal with the question of your own mortality and the mortality of others. And when you look at the possibility that there is no eternal, that there is no afterlife, that we are simply biological creatures, then you get into the really hard issue of dealing with the fact that when people die, people just die.
When we're never going to see them again, there's a lot less comfort, and that false comfort offered by religion, it's a little hard to get over sometimes.
It is. And we've got a special guest today, Rebecca Hensler. She is the founder, the driving force behind Grief Beyond Belief. Rebecca, welcome to the program today.
Thank you.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about Grief Beyond Belief?
So Grief Beyond Belief's mission is to provide grief support for people who are grieving without any sort of belief in God or in any kind of afterlife. Either the Christian or Judeo-Christian idea of heaven or hell, or any other lasting spirit beyond death. It's not just for people who don't believe in a formal religion. It's also for people who really don't believe in that people's spirits last beyond life. The idea, basically, it's a online grief support network. So we're providing the same sort of grief support that many grief support sites online are providing, but what makes Grief Beyond Belief different is that Grief Beyond Belief is specifically for people who are unbelievers.
And that's one thing I want to mention, that we as Living After Faith have recently come to a decision that we had to close our blog down to people of faith. We wanted it to be a safe place where people can come and discuss atheism, coming out of atheism, without having to worry about being proselyted to and people coming on board and saying, have you ever thought that maybe you didn't really know God in the power of his son? And we're like, yeah, I kind of figured that out after preaching that shit for 20 years. But
that's one of the things I like when I read Grief Beyond Belief's mission statement on the Facebook page, that it says, this is a safe space for non-theists, not a place for you to come and talk about religion. And I like that a lot. And actually, some of our readers noted that they really enjoyed the fact that we decided to close it off, because we had a couple of people come in who wanted to tell us all about Jesus.
And I've had to be very clear about that all along, that it wasn't a space for debate, that there is obviously a place for debate in this conversation, and that there are, at this point, hundreds, if not thousands, of places online to go and debate whether or not there is an afterlife. That is not what Grief Beyond Belief is for. And in fact, when you're grieving, that's really the last thing you need, regardless of what you believe or do not believe. You're not looking for a debate. You're looking for comfort.
And, that's really not the good time to look at the question itself. That's a question that's best handled when you're not in a place of grief and when you're not in the immediacy of the pain and the suffering. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, and yet it's actually the loss of someone you love, for some people, actually is the catalyst to reevaluating what they really believe. And that's something that I really wanted to honor and to provide support for, was not just the people who already knew, I don't believe in an afterlife. I think this is all ridiculous. Once you die, you die. There are a lot of people out there who, when they start the grieving process, when they lose someone they love or when someone they love gets sick, that's when they evaluate whether or not everything they've ever been taught is true or not. And once that starts happening, that can be this incredibly painful process because, of course, you are grieving at the exact same time as everything around you that you believe to be true might be crumbling. And we need to be able to provide support for those people who are both in that moment of grief and in that moment of losing what they've believed. And for many of those people, that also leads to conflicts with the people around them who still believe and are also grieving. So you can see how complicated that situation has to be for a person. If we're able to provide some support, then that means that they're not grieving alone.
That's wonderful. I admire that so much. That's a perfect way to describe it.
So let's start at the beginning when someone has lost a person, or maybe the loss has occurred at some time in the past, but they realize they need grief support from a non-sectarian source. They come to Grief Beyond Belief. What do they find? How do they attach themselves? How do they get into the picture?
Well, I think it might be interesting to start a little bit before that and how Grief Beyond Belief came into being.
Okay.
Because I myself was in the situation of being in a place of intense grief. My 3-month-old son died, and I was going through everything that a grieving parent goes through. And grieving parents were a whole different species, basically. It's for some reason just completely changes you as a human being to lose your child.
I can understand that.
And when I was grieving my son Jude, I sought out grief support on the internet. I found a grief support site that was specifically for grieving parents. And at first, it was wonderful. It was, look, there are all these other people who have been through this, who have survived this, and who are here to provide, to share their grief and provide comfort. And then I discovered that a lot of what was being provided as so-called comfort was things I absolutely didn't believe. When I would be told my baby was in heaven, and I'm like, okay, except you know what? He's really not. My baby is dead. And I would have people say things that to me come across as absurd. You know, the day your child dies is his angel day, or it's the day he got his wings. And those are not just not comforting to me, but to some degree trivializing to me.
Exactly, and a bit insulting.
It certainly felt that way. And people weren't trying to be mean. This is how they're handling their grief. But to me, it was very unhelpful. And so really, it only took me a few months to start thinking, there really should be a site like this that is specifically for people who are unbelievers. And once the idea was in my mind, it wouldn't go away. I knew that, you know, a few months after my own son's death was not the time for me to be starting a new project. And so it really was. It took a year and a half for me to really start working on founding Grief Beyond Belief. But it came out of that experience of trying to seek out grief support, finding support that really wasn't working for me, and thinking about the fact that I couldn't possibly be the only one who was experiencing that. One of the things that inspired me to make sure that Grief Beyond Belief was a safe place for people going through that process of letting go of God and letting go of belief in an afterlife was that one of my first friends who was another grieving parent was in that process. And that had never occurred to me. I only knew what it was like to lose my child when I had never really believed in an afterlife. My eyes were open to what an intense experience that was to be going through that process at the time. And that's what made me say Grief Beyond Belief has to be safe for both people who never believed and for people who are coming out of religion.
That's wonderful. That's I think, an amazing, a really well-needed resource. And this is something we talk about a lot, is the need for creating community, for providing support to our fellow non-believers, because churches do that a lot. And the atheist movement lately, we've all been kind of creating things for each other and for ourselves. You saw a need. You said, we need support group for people who don't believe. And pow, there you go. And this is amazing work. Thank you.
And I have to say that Greta Christina was a big influence in that happening. The conversations I had with her as I was realizing what the need was really opened me up to this bigger picture of the way in which people who are unbelievers or are becoming unbelievers still need some of that support and community that they were finding in a church, or that they never found in a church but haven't found elsewhere, and that's something that we can create. I just thought this is the one piece of it that is the right thing for me to be doing at this time, and that was very much because of my own son's death.
When someone comes to Grief Beyond Belief, tell us how this works, how they can hook up and begin to work through their process.
Well, currently Grief Beyond Belief is simply a page on Facebook. And so people come to it, usually people who already are involved or, have a Facebook account. And I have no idea how many people come to Grief Beyond Belief and click on like, which is really all you have to do to become a member, and just spend time reading what other people say and realizing I'm not the only one who's feeling these things, or reading someone else's process of grieving and thinking, wow, that particular process might help me, that might make me feel comfortable. One thing people who haven't been through a intense loss yet may not realize is how much when you're really in the depths of grief, you kind of think like you're going crazy.
Yeah.
You have thoughts that in any other context would seem nuts. And so just finding out that other people feel the same way makes a huge difference. So there are probably people out there who what they do is they come to Grief Beyond Belief and they read what other people have to say. And that in itself is healing. There are also people, obviously, who get involved in posting, who post comments about their own experiences, who post quotes or ideas or articles they've read that were healing for them. And then my role in it is sort of twofold. One is, obviously, it's my role to keep Grief Beyond Belief a safe space. And that takes a certain amount of work. But I also, about once a day, not every day, but almost every day, post something to the membership, something that everyone who has clicked like is going to receive on their Facebook page that I found helpful in some way or thought might be helpful for someone. Sometimes they're articles about grieving. one of the things as not just a non-believer, but a skeptic and someone who loves science, I go looking for information that's actually research-based about grieving. What are people really learning about grieving when they study this topic? And then I also post just things, quotes, a whole lot of personal writing. So I go searching the internet for where are people writing about the process of grieving as atheists or as other non-religious people. And I post those articles for people to read. And so being a member of Grief Beyond Belief means that just about every day you have something coming to you that might in some way be helpful to you. And then the conversations about those articles, those quotes, etc., are, I think, what's healing for most people.
Well, the things you said that really rings home with me is, and as a pastor dealt with this in a religious context, but I have not as an atheist because I haven't lost anyone, but is the thought pattern of you think things that seem to be a little bit crazy when you're in the grieving process, and it simply is a symptom, a sign that you need to, I guess, actively grieve the loss instead of running from the loss or not acknowledging it.
Oh, exactly. And that process of active grieving is something that we sometimes talk about on Grief Beyond Belief. It was one of the recent posts was a piece of writing about the process of active grieving. And then we had a discussion about what are the different ways in which people do that, and does it help you or not? And there are some people who say, hey, I tried all that, and that's not very helpful for me, which brings up one of the most important things about grieving, which is that we all do it differently, that there isn't a right way to grieve, that there isn't some system that heals you, there isn't a time that you're going to feel better. And certainly that has been proposed over and over again. What's a normal, healthy amount of time to spend grieving? And the fact is, we don't have answers for those questions, not because science hasn't found them, but because people are individuals and we all go through grief differently.
It's one of those answers that doesn't exist. And I think it's very important that you point out people are individuals. I've known people who lost a spouse that they have been with for decades, and they literally never stop their grieving process. I mean, it when something is a part of your life for so much of your life, you can't just say, okay, you've got 6 months, get over it.
Well, and that's one of the things that I think we need to recognize is that grief is something that we come to live with, not something that we get over. And that's certainly true for all grieving parents. And I suspect it's true for pretty much everyone. We learn to live with it to differing degrees. And we don't go back to being the person we were before. That's not what healing from grief is about. You heal from grief by somehow managing to become a functional person with that grief in your life.
One of the things that people used to say to me all the time, I cannot count the number of times I heard it, is, I just want my life to be normal again.
Looking for normal is, I find, to be a mistake, but I understand what people are saying when they say that. I mean, one of the interesting things that we've discussed recently at Grief Beyond Belief that keeps coming up is this question of, if believers really believe that they're going to see the person again, whoever, they're going to see the person who's died again, and that person is fine and they're in heaven on their cloud with their harp or whatever, why are they still just as sad as non-believers? And I think it's a fascinating question. I have no idea what the answer is, but it's interesting to me how many people have asked it recently and said, there's something sort of weird about that if you truly believe in this, shouldn't you somehow not be as overwhelmed with grief as the person who thinks my loved one is just plain dead and I'm never going to see them again?
One of the things I tried to, as a pastor, I tried to make funerals an upbeat thing instead of a downbeat thing, trying to say, hey, we're welcoming this person into heaven. It's a good time. This is what this was all about. This is why we live this hard life. This is why we... And those never really caught on.
And boy, does that stuff piss off unbelievers who are grieving when they are being told, be happy for him, he's worshiping at Jesus' throne in heaven. And they're like, oh, no, he's not. And one of the things that certainly grieving parents get is God needed another angel, your baby's in a better place. And to a parent, there is no better place for a baby than in their parents' arms.
Right.
And it is so offensive. And that when we have discussions that are about what are the things that piss us off, boy, is that one of the ones that always comes up.
I bet a lot of people hear it's all part of God's plan.
Oh.
That's another offensive one. That hurts to hear.
It really does. And I think that that's one of the things that believers don't understand. And that's part of why often when believers hear about grief beyond belief or come in contact with it in some way, they really don't get that being fed these supposedly comforting bits of mythology is not just not helpful, it is painful for many non-believers. And because they don't understand that, they're like, well, why can't you just, use the same grief support as the rest of us? Because we're trying to help. People mean it nicely, and somehow that's supposed to make it unnecessary for us as unbelievers to find our own place to grieve without believers telling us those things.
And then, of course, they want to say, you're just mad at God.
Oh, yes. And that is, I think, one of the most offensive things that I've heard is the you're mad at God. Because, no, if you do not believe in God, you cannot be mad at God. That's like you're mad at Santa Claus. It really, really pisses people off. And that process of getting angered and getting hurt over and over again is, I think, destructive to the process of healing from a loss. And that's one of the reasons unbelievers really need their own space to heal, is because I think that process of getting angry over and over again makes healing harder. You can't heal and be mad at the same time.
Yeah, I believe anger is probably one of the processes of grief, but it has to advance beyond that. And as long as someone is taking that wound and jabbing a hot poker into it, that wound is not going to get better.
I think that's very well put, Rich. It's not that you can't heal and be mad. It's that you can't constantly be mad and also heal. And it's different to being mad that someone is dead is very different from being mad that the people are supposed to be comforting you are pissing you off over and over again. Those are two whole different things.
That is very well good point, because yes, you're absolutely right. One of the things that, and again, I have not faced the death of a close loved one since I have become an atheist. So a lot of the reason people have asked me questions, I'm like, I really can't answer that because I don't know, haven't been there. But it would seem to me, and maybe I'm just different, but because I have walked away from a faith that was not a secure faith. In other words, we didn't believe once saved, always saved. We believed that, if a burglar showed up in your house and you said, oh, shit, and then he shot you, you'd go to hell for saying shit. But, so I guess, there was always that threat of hell hanging over you. So your own death was kind of a fearful thing. But it would seem to me, just from my own experience, just from what I feel personally, that now that I don't have heaven and hell hanging over myself, facing my own death seems like to me it would be a little bit easier, just knowing that I simply will not exist. Does that also, or do you find from the people you talk to, that also can kind of convey a little bit into grieving the loss of another person, that they realize it's final, it is closure, it's over at this point?
And you don't have to fear that person being in hell and burning forever.
And tortured and horrible things.
Oh, exactly. I think that it's one of the things that I've seen that's actually most abusive that religious people do to grieving non-religious people is suggest that if the person who has died was not themselves a believer, that therefore they're in hell. And it's just unimaginable to me to bring that up with someone when they're grieving.
That's crazy offensive. Oh my God.
It. Oh yeah. And I mean, that's one of the hardest things actually, is reading in Grief Beyond Belief the ways in which people had the loss of someone they loved made more difficult by some of these beliefs about hell and burning for eternity, etc. Is there you've got someone who's, for example, I mean, the worst of it, of course, is the people whose loved ones, when they were dying, were being proselytized to and having deathbed conversions sort of urged upon them while they were trying to go through the process of letting go. And you do hear these stories. My grandmother was a non-believer, and the chaplain kept coming to her room and trying to get her to accept Jesus. And that's a terrible thing, because then you're not just remembering the loss of someone you loved, you're also remembering that when that person was dying, they were going through this sort of harassment. I think that makes it much more painful. And then people experience the same thing immediately following it. And then the worst of it is the people who are told, well, the reason your loved one is dead is because you didn't believe. To me, that's just unimaginably abusive to say to someone. Even someone who themselves really knows that it's not true. But what about the person who is really just in the process of letting go of their beliefs? If they've got people around them who are telling them, the reason someone you loved is dead is because you were not believing right, or you didn't pray hard enough, or whatever, and they're trying to let go of it at the same time, it's just unimaginably difficult, I think.
You were talking earlier about the telling someone their loved one is now in hell. I think one of the worst abuses I saw as a pastor, I was at a funeral and had been asked to speak. I did speak, but I was not the main speaker at the funeral. And the main speaker at the funeral, it was a closed casket service, or they had, you had the viewing time and then the casket's closed during the message. And he asked the mortician to come up, said, open this box up. And they opened the box up and said, this is a righteous woman. This was a holy woman. We all know that she's going to heaven right now. But I want her 4 boys to stand up right now. Boys, walk up here and see Mama, because if you don't change your life, you're never going to see your Mama again. I was there at the funeral where this happened.
That's the most horrible thing I've ever heard.
You hear about these things. You really do. And it's quite extraordinary, and especially to me as someone who was never a religious person, it was shocking when I first started. Now I'm sort of used to hearing these stories, but when I first started hearing about stuff like that, I was just, I have to admit, really quite shocked. It had never occurred to me that someone would do something like that. But now I know they really, really do.
Even at that point, I could not imagine what those four guys, and I didn't even know them. I really didn't know the woman that was dead. It was kind of a courtesy thing. I was even involved. But I was like, how on earth could that possibly be a beneficial thing for these people to? And I think so much of what the religious world pushes towards people at the time of death is so it's not just not beneficial, it's so counterproductive.
Well, I think that that's an interesting thing. I actually did a piece of writing myself about my first experience at a religious funeral following founding Grief Beyond Belief. I was at the Baptist funeral of an old family friend, and it was interesting to me that what the pastor said was he listed ways in which people sort of fail to grieve. And it was very interesting that I found that I agreed with many of the things that he listed. He was saying, people are taught to move on. People are taught to somehow try and kind of replace the loss. People are taught to grieve alone. And I was like, oh yeah, this is really interesting. I really agree with this guy. And then at the end of this list of ways in which we don't necessarily grieve in healthy ways, he basically said, and the answer is to accept Jesus and believe that, and then you're able to believe that you'll see the person again. And it was fascinating that this answer, to me, was completely and totally useless. That this man had come up with the right questions and then offered this answer that made no sense at all. And it really brings up that even if, the gruesome story you just described, the open the casket and look at your mama part, is an extreme version of it, and yet this is an extremely common experience at funerals, that the response, the Christian response to death is, if you are doing the right thing, if you believe the right things, if you're praying right, if you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, then you do not really have to grieve. Then you have not really lost this person. And a lot of complaints that I read have to do with the using someone's death to try to convert people, to try and bring people either into the faith or back to the faith. And I think that that's another form of abuse, is that manipulative, death as a cattle prod. I mean,
wow.
Yeah. And
it's a threat.
It is a threat. I'm trying to figure out quite how to express it. One of the things that I heard quite a few months ago on a podcast was someone who, the quote was, "My tragedy is not your soapbox." And I thought that was brilliant.
My mentor in the news business died, and, I said I haven't really dealt with a close death, and not necessarily a family member, but John and I have known each other, or had known each other for, I was 16 when I met him. I'm 49 now, so that's 8 years. Did I mention math is hard? Anyway, John and I had known each other, and he brought me into the news business, taught me the news business. It's the business I make my living in today. In radio, I mean, it was, he and I were close throughout all those years. I found out he had cancer kind of third party, because he wasn't the kind of guy to go out and tell you these things. Hunted him down, tracked him down. We had about an hour-long telephone conversation. 2 weeks later, he died. And he had told me he was fine, and it just crushed me. And I had put a bit on my Facebook wall about it. And someone who I knew in high school, who I haven't even seen in more than 30 years, says, this is God's attempt to bring you back to him.
He's trying to get your attention, I think they said.
Yeah.
How could God kill my friend to try to get my attention? What?
It's so true. And that's the death as a cattle prod bit that I'm talking about, is I'm going to use this tragedy to somehow convince you to return to the faith. And then the idea that God would use this, and that, of course, brings up all the obvious questions about God. You know, how could anyone, if God is good, why would God do these insanely abusive things?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if God really has the power to just stop someone's life on my behalf, why doesn't he just show up to me, just walk up and say, hey, dude, me and you, we're finna have talk, whether you want to or not. It's time for us to get it on here. I mean, it seems like such an absurd, you know, if you take yourself out of the picture and imagine yourself as God and you think, okay, I want to get that person to recognize me. So what's the best way to do this? Let's see. I'll get him fired on his job. I'll kill his mom and dad. I mean, you know.
Then he'll love me.
But the fact is, a lot of the ideas about God and grief and other people's deaths are sort of bizarre or seem absurd, at least to me. I mean, the whole idea that, you know, people talk about, oh, well, you know, everyone's praying for your child. Well, okay, then if my child doesn't die and you all think it's because everyone's praying for them, then what about the person whose child does die? I mean, that came up recently in a discussion that was about someone whose baby didn't die and who believed that, in fact, that was because everyone was praying for their baby. And we were having a conversation about this piece of writing. And to me, okay, I have to admit, even though I'm a non-believer, there were hundreds of people praying for my son. And if I did believe, how hurtful would that be to think, with all those people praying for Jude, God didn't care enough to save him? And the answer that you get is, well, then God wanted another heaven. And it's like, oh, so it's you win both ways.
Right.
That's ridiculous.
Or the third one you get is, but God has a perfect plan, and this is all part of his perfect plan. And my answer to that is, yes, God has a perfect plan, and he needs 40,000 dead African babies today to make that happen.
It doesn't make any sense. And that's, I think, one of the things that's sometimes hard for me in terms of my ability to provide support personally is I don't really get it about religion and all these things that religious people say about death don't make a whole hell of a lot of sense to me, and never did. And I don't understand the process of letting go of them because I never held them. And so one of the things about starting Grief Beyond Belief was being able to recognize that I may not understand, but there are lots of people out there who do. And so my goal is to help connect these people to each other. I don't have to be able to do everything myself. When you create a network, what you're doing is creating the structure where we can help each other. And if someone has a question, it's okay that I don't have the answer.
And what you're doing, and what we focus on a lot here on Living After Faith, is building Atheist Community, building the community that can serve itself. When I was a pastor, we went all out when a member of the church experienced a loss, whether it was someone in the church that died or someone close to someone in the church that died. We could be there within an hour, 2 hours, with food, with we had commercial coffee makers. We had somebody trained that would be there to help the family, to run the coffee makers, to basically run the house while the family grieved. We just kind of came in and took over and took care of everything so they could focus on nothing if they didn't want to. All they had to do is just be. They didn't have to take care of things. And, I look in the atheist community, I don't see that. And maybe on our part, that was a little bit of overkill. But still, bad word. Maybe that was going a little overboard. But still, in the atheist community, I think that what you're doing is starting a new way and a genuine way of dealing with something every single one of us will face at some point. And I congratulate you for that.
Well, thank you. I think one thing that is really important for me to make sure people hear is that this is something that's growing. And this is something that, this started with an idea that we could provide online grief support for people who are non-believers. And starting a Facebook page, it's not enough. And I recognize that it's not enough. There are plans that I'm making now. There will be an independent website, hopefully next summer. And it will provide a lot more than a Facebook page can provide. It will have space for people to post their own memorials. It will have more space for people to have discussions. But I also recognize that ultimately online grief support really isn't enough. And so one thing I would like to see happen in the future is there be much greater access to in-person grief support that is non-religious. And I think that Grief Beyond Belief can play a role in making that happen. But ultimately, atheist and humanist and other non-believer communities in cities and towns all over the world will have to be able to form those supportive groups and provide those services. And I know that people are already thinking about it, and if Grief Beyond Belief has been part of helping people think about how to make that happen, then I really feel like, it's very much worth it.
It's a wonderful start, and it's an avenue that people can hook up with each other in person already. Mm-hmm. If I look on Facebook, I can see that somebody lives in an area near me, and if we're both part of, say, Grief Beyond Belief, I say, hey, let's get together, you, me, and this other person that also lives in the area, and let's have coffee together. Those little things are a big deal.
Yeah, they are really a big deal. And online grief support is very different from in person, really being there for someone and really comforting them. And I totally recognize that. There's a big difference between being able to, click like on a page and being able to actually sit with someone while they grieve. One of the things I really do intend to have be part of the eventual Grief Beyond Belief website will be lists of resources, for example, humanist chaplains, so that if someone is going through a loss and needs access to grief support, to a humanist chaplain, to an atheist grief counselor, they'll have a place to go look and find who's available in their area. And I think that ought to be helpful as well. But there are things that can really be provided online. Some of the most powerful things are the experience of telling stories about someone you've lost. It's been fascinating learning what really does help. To what degree just having the opportunity to say someone's name and tell someone about the person you love makes a difference in grieving. One of the things, I knew that it made a difference for me, and so every time, for example, a grieving parent comes on Grief Beyond Belief and says, my child has died, my baby has died, one of the first things I do is I ask the child's name. Or if someone comes on and says, my mother has died, this is what I'm going through, I say, can you tell us something about her? And the things people post are just beautiful. I mean, the stories people tell about the people they love are wonderful to read. And I think the process of telling those stories is clearly healing.
One thing I would like to do is encourage our listeners to go to the Grief Beyond Belief, and we'll put a link to the Grief Beyond Belief Facebook page on the blog. So go there and just click it. Click like on it. And let Rebecca Hensler know, especially if you're someone who does have some of these skills and can help, because I know that there are a lot of former ministers like myself who are listening to Living After Faith and who want to be active but don't know a way to help. And if by the same token, if you're a web coder and she needs help with a web page, hit her up and say, hey, look, I can help you out. Here's what I can do. But let's get behind what Rebecca's doing. She's trying to build community. Let's help her with our community and come together and say, hey, what do you need me to do? Here's what I can do. Would that be okay, Rebecca?
What would be fantastic is actually if people wanted to send information like that to my email address, which is just griefbeyondbelief@gmail.com.
Okay.
Then I'd be able to start compiling lists that can be put up on a website when we start the independent website. Or if you have those kinds of skills, absolutely. Because one thing I recognize is it was possible for one person to start this. It's not possible for this to just remain a project of mine. And all along, the intent has been, once I start this, it's going to have to become something much bigger, and it's not going to be just my project anymore. It will be a project of a community,
and that's beautiful.
I think so too. It's not easy to figure out these things. It's definitely a whole different kind of project to put together a group than to just start something yourself. But I do know that the community has such great need.
The churches have had millennia to work on the way that they deal with this, and they've got the benefit of being able to create lies as they go.
To manipulate, to create fear, and to use that to keep people under control. So
what you're doing, though, is open, honest, it's refreshing, it's incredibly necessary, and the way you're doing it is just absolutely beautiful. I hope that this becomes a model for how Atheist Community is developed, not only around the center of grieving, but there are so many. The hospice process, I just wrote that note down. I am not familiar with an atheist hospice program, but what's more important than helping someone when they're dying and you call a chaplain and he's going to try to convert you, and that's horrible. So I hope that what our listeners will take away from this is a beautiful program, and they'll try to help and be involved in it. And those certainly who are going through grief will turn there for help. But at the same time, we can look at this as a model and say, I can help with XYZ part of the community, and do it the same way. Start it knowing that you're not going to be the answer to everyone's question, that you can't possibly meet everyone's need, but you can start something and through that bring enough people in who can meet those needs.
Well, I think that you can do that. We all find our place in a much bigger picture. And for me, Grief Beyond Belief was not something I ever would have thought I'd be doing. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it didn't occur to me that I had anything to contribute. Sometimes something happens in your life that suddenly makes it necessary for you to take a step in a particular direction you didn't intend to go. And that's not God's plan. And it's not that everything has a reason. It's that sometimes we go through something terrible. There is no reason. There's not a reason my son died, but I can take what happened to me and what happened to him and kind of make reason out of it as a human being.
And that is what life is all about. We make reason, we make meaning. The only meaning my life has is the meaning I give it.
Amen.
Our guest today on Living After Faith is Rebecca Hensler. She is the founder and force behind Grief Beyond Belief.
And you can find that at facebook.com/faithfreegriefsupport, or just search for Grief Beyond Belief. We'll put links up on our webpage and to her email address. So if you have something to offer as far as the Grief Beyond Belief project as a whole, you can do that there. I'm Deanna Joy Lyons.
I'm Rich Lyons.
Come laugh with me.
Thank you for listening to the Living After Faith podcast with Rich and Deanna Joy Lyons. Living After Faith is a podcast designed to help you as you leave religion and move forward with your life. We are the official podcast of RecoveringReligionists.com, a recovery group founded by Dr. Darrell Ray, the author of The God Virus. The music for this show is provided by Morrison's Prophecy. See livingafterfaith.com for a link to more music from Morrison's Prophecy. We welcome your feedback, and you can find phone numbers and email addresses at livingafterfaith.com, at facebook.com/livingafterfaith, and follow us on Twitter at LAF with me.